about the Sustainable Development Goals, right? It's a fantastic plan to take us to a safe place in the future in many aspects here. And we have only about 5 years to go before we are supposed to be reaching all these 17 goals and the 169 targets that are connected with the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, there's much, much more work that needs to be done. We're not really there in many of the areas and many of the targets, and definitely many of the goals. And much of this work needs to be done in the continent of Africa. So while many areas of Africa have seen inspiring levels of progress in recent years, the situation remains stark. Of course, the continent is a home to 16% of the world's population, but the economy of this continent only stands for about 3%. So this is a critical junction for Africa here that we're facing, and many, of course, challenges connected to this. So we need to embrace the work for the SDGs to empower the transition of this continent. Of course, it needs investments, and the prioritization of these investments can unlock the benefits for the humans, the people, and also the businesses, of course, and nature in this part of the world. So we're going to talk about this now, and I have wonderful guests here. And I'd like to present Sandrine Henton, Managing Director, EG Capital. Wonderful to have you here. And I have Matteo Calabrino, Vice President, Bankers Without Boundaries. Terrific. And Jacqueline Omotale, that's you, Jacqueline.
That's me.
I think I was looking at the wrong person here. Sorry, the cold is getting to me a bit here. Terribly sorry for that. Jacqueline Omotalade, you're head of partnership, engagements, and investment at Paxera Global. So, thank you all for joining us here. Are you comfortable?
We're comfortable.
Absolutely.
You're comfortable for a while. That's terrific. You were sitting on sheepskin, so it's helping a bit. So, Jacqueline, let's start with you. Paxera Global is a nonprofit organization. It's not really a financial institution. So could you please set the stage for us to really grasp this better than I could do in my intro here? What challenges are we facing?
I am happy to set the stage, and I think what Paxera Global does, because it is a nonprofit, it's not an investment, although I do come from an investment background, I think it is a critical bridge between the private sector and the nonprofit sector. As we know, what we need to achieve, the SDG goals, it is $1 trillion movement, right? It is not going to be solved just by the philanthropic sector. And we truly have to understand that and understand to be able to speak the language that investment speaks to really drive the development that we want to see happen in terms of a green energy transition. And Paxera Global has positioned itself to be that wedge in between the nonprofit world, but also the investment sector. And that is very much what a lot of my role around Paxera Global is about.
So what insights can you share from your perspective, from your organization, in terms of course, the financing, need of the financing in this sector? Could you elaborate a bit on this?
So a couple of things. One, I would say that I approach Africa and I approach investment in Africa, and previously I approach my portfolio of investments in Africa from a very optimistic perspective. There are so many opportunities there for investment. In fact, I think when you think about like growth and the opportunity for growth, I don't see another market where the potential is that, right? It's not going to happen pretty much anywhere else in the world. It is also an opportunity to renew and reimagine how investment is done, and I will give you an example. So a lot of the work that Paxera is focused on, and I've also focused on in the past, is around community ownership models. And like, what does that look like? And how do you de-risk that? And as my esteemed colleague and I here, we're talking kind of offline about, right, adding another complexity into what is already a very complex idea of how investments can and should be done. So first and foremost, I think lots of times people start off the conversation around Africa and investment in Africa from a very, like, there are challenges, but there are also so many opportunities, and the rewards that can happen in terms of like growth and portfolio opportunities for me far outweigh the perceived and actual risk.
Do you have a favorite example to share?
So for example, we heavily invested and worked in Nigeria during the pandemic, working in northern Nigeria. So thinking about the security and other challenges, right? But we were ever to partner with both like the private and the public sector around small and medium-sized businesses to develop the infrastructure as well as the skills and tools necessary to actually quadruple some of their returns even during the pandemic.
That's a great example. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. So, Bankers Without Boundaries, we had a representative here just in the previous panel. So, Matteo, you describe your entity as the Bankers for the Earth, an investment bank for the Earth. I think it's such a beautiful framing. So, how do you really differentiate yourself from other type of banking? Could you tell us about this, please?
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much to the We Don't Have Time team for the fantastic invitation. So I guess that the key differentiation from the rest of the investment banks is that we mobilize capital entirely and only for climate, green, and social projects. Nothing else. And that basically means to develop innovative financial instruments that can really attract the different forms of capital, not just the traditional one, to where it is the most needed. And this is truly the mission of our firm, which started almost 10 years ago, and now fast track to today, it is in more than 40 different countries around the world.
Wow.
Yes. Mainly focusing in emerging markets in Asia and Africa, but also a lot in Europe as well. And the key point on that is to understand that the investment banking skills that are so much needed for a lot of different organizations in terms of raising capital, structuring investment, et cetera, are not accessible to everybody. And I'm talking about NGOs, I'm talking about people that require capital to do fantastic things under a social and green perspective, but do not necessarily have the skills and the capacity to do that. So our business model is based on the fact of trying to provide those kind of skills to those people. And so far it's been a fantastic journey.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Could you elaborate a bit on the quality of life and the human aspect of what you do, especially the focus here in Africa?
Sure thing. So just to give you a practical example, we have recently launched something called the Africa Capital Hub, or ACH. And the hub has the purpose to mobilize 1 billion of USD by 2030 in green and social projects. And the beauty of that is that the purpose is really to mobilize capital for government-owned and government-aligned projects. And this is going to be at no cost for all the players involved, which, because it's a philanthropic organization, we are supported by philanthropists in doing that. And this allows us to create a completely different business model that can really support all the players that are in need, from government to social enterprises and so on and so forth, and raising capital for things like reducing children mortality rates, or improving school meals and school feeding in schools where it is the most needed, and keeping people in school. So things with a concrete and real impact.
Well, that's truly inspiring. So turning now to you, Sandrine, you run a private equity fund in Nairobi, Kenya?
Yeah, I'm actually replacing Sandrine, right? Obviously, I'm not Sandrine.
Because I was a bit confused there, as you noticed. It's like that's a female name, but it's a French name, so sometimes the French names can be male and female. So I was a bit thrown off.
True.
Please introduce yourself.
So yeah, my name is actually Guillaume. It's also a French name, as you can hear, and I represent an organization that's called SIFI, which stands for SDG Impact Finance Initiative, and which has a lot of similarities with what you do, Matteo, as well. Our goal is also to mobilize private capital for the SDGs in emerging markets. We want to mobilize up to $1 billion US for funds in impact investing. And we do that by essentially providing first loss equity capital to those funds. So that means because we want those impact investing funds to strive, we want to help them de-risk themselves by investing in junior equity tranches. So that's where you take the first risks if there are any losses. And by doing so, we actually attract private investors into those solutions, and we help them scaling up. So that's how essentially we operate. We also help new solutions to exist, innovative solutions to exist, by providing them with grants to do feasibility studies, for instance, or to start the business. And we do ecosystem building by talking to governments, to regulators, but also to stock exchanges, to rating agencies. And together we are trying to build an ecosystem that actually makes sense for impact investing and that facilitates the investment from private investors and institutional players.
So Guillaume, where are you based? I think you didn't say
I'm
that.
based in Switzerland, so not very far from Davos, but on the other side in Geneva.
So the company is, or the entity is based in...
The entity is based in Switzerland, yes, but it's an international platform. We were launched, I would say, by Switzerland, by the government of Switzerland, and also the main financial institutions. So UBS Optimus Foundation is part of the board as well. And we were joined more recently by the government of Luxembourg, and a few more partners are going to join soon. So we will have a nice announcement to make soon.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for replacing Sandrine, and sorry about the confusion here.
No worries at all. Thank you.
So I'm going to open up the forum here for any of you to answer these questions that I prepared. So let's start with an overarching question about what is the key change in how we're operating that will be able to unlock these crucial investments that will enhance the SDG work in Africa?
So I think what my
you go
three
ahead.
esteemed colleagues and I are all saying is around like systemic change.
Ah.
Like we are actually creating new ecosystems. Like for instance, even with Pixera Global, we have a systemic climate action collaborative, which is made up of 15 nonprofits. And it's almost, I see it as complementary to what my esteemed gentlemen on my side are doing as well, in terms of we are unlocking like $1 billion as well, to really kind of rethink and reimagine and de-risk both Africa, but also the broader global south as well as the global north. So I think that the insight and perspective of those who are willing to reimagine and rethink how things are done and have been done. And I think particularly when you think about like investments in green investments, right? And I'm glad my esteemed colleague here pointed out that those are different than like traditional investments, right? And it is even amongst my friends who are in traditional finance, all of them don't possess that skill set. And are really trying to learn because it is impacting everybody's portfolio at this point, some part of climate.
So we're talking about systemic change here, and of course there's so many players that need to be able to play this, well, to change this thinking together in parallel, or most hopefully together. So we have the governments, we have the NGOs, we have the different businesses, we have the different levels of businesses. So how do we best facilitate that they could do this trajectory quickly enough together? What buttons do we push? Guillaume?
Well, you're right. It's a value chain, right, that needs to be changed. It's a system, actually, that needs to be changed or adapted. I think, it's super powerful in creating wealth. We've built a system that was able to bring us where we are today. 8 billion individuals, on average, much more educated, wealthy, etc., than a few centuries ago. But we've seen the limitation of that system now. Climate change is one of them. It's not the only one. We have all 17 SDGs that need to be addressed. And the question becomes, how do we adapt this economic system to make it sustainable for the long term and next generations? And how do we make sure that the system actually brings positive externalities and reduces negative ones? And to do that, I think the key is investment, right? We can't do without investment. It has to start with investment. And so once you say that, the only question which is valid is how do you bring more private investments into projects? So all along the value chain, funds, companies that produce positive externalities. And how do you motivate and incentivize capital to flow towards those projects? And I think, what we're talking about today is really that, right? Mobilizing private investments. And to do that, you need to, first of all, de-risk that investment, make sure that the investment is less risky, and also change the perception from investors, because sometimes, it's not as risky as it looks. It is not risky actually to invest in microfinance, for instance, in Africa. It's not risky at all, but you still need to make sure that people understand that more clearly. So the work with rating agencies is super important. And then there is the questions of liquidity regulation. So it's bringing all of those people together and create an investment ecosystem that is conducive for that type of investment and that values positive externalities much more, because this has economic value as well.
Thank you, Guillaume. You mentioned microcredits. Are there any other innovative financing models that might be able to speed up the enhancement of what needs to happen in Africa?
Well, I guess that there are plenty that as BWB and the Africa Capital Hub, but also
Microphone closer, please.
my esteemed
Yes.
panels here are taken into account. For instance, one of the typologies of models that have been really going on in the latest period, especially under a social perspective, is the outcome-based financing systems. So I think that you mentioned before UBS, Optimus Foundation, they were really the pioneers that put this into the market. And now we are taking inspiration from them in terms of developing financing and financial mechanisms that, based on the results that are achieved on the ground, can sort of change the interest rate and the returns to the investors. So that's definitely one. In addition to that, we have heard about blended finance so much. In my view, the current version of the blended finance is not working to the point that is needed. So innovation is going to be fundamental on that side. And for instance, what we try to do at BWB is really to play with all these different blended finance structures that we can apply to funds in relation to green and social investments. And there are plenty of sectors where this could work, from water to and blue economy to agriculture, and we talked about before the role of philanthropies. So it's a combination of different forms of capitals, philanthropic, public, private, that comes together to sort of de-risk the investment and attract more and more capital. So I think that in terms of innovation side, quite a few things are happening in Africa. Now, over the time, will tell us if all these innovative instruments will work as expected.
Thank you, Mathieu. Jacqueline?
And I would just like to add one thing, because I think my esteemed colleague here made a very good point, and as a very proud African, I think the storytelling as well, right? Because there are real risk, and then there are made-up risk, right? And I think it is so important that as these innovations happen, that those stories are being told.
Indeed.
That the moment is now for Africa, and Africa is the future.
Thank you for pointing this out, because there's always a risk of there's this sort of, you build on bad stories and you think this is actually the truth, and the risk is inflated instead of assessed as it should be.
Yes, and I think it's about the investor risk appetite, but also investor knowledge, right?
Knowledge, yeah.
And as more and more innovations happen, I think it's very important to have platforms like that, or like this, where we start sharing that knowledge and sharing that Africa is open for business. And folks, if they truly want to be bullish, if they truly are thinking of future and forward thinking, then Africa is where their money should come.
Thank you for spelling that out so clearly. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I did touch base on before. How can the African nations become better prepared to sort of open up and also align their policies to make it possible for investors to actually step into their countries? What is needed in terms of this transition here from the policy side? What are you lacking, Guillaume? You're focusing on investments.
I think one key element is, from the investment perspective, is the access to liquidity. So we need functioning capital markets in Africa, as well as in the entire world, actually. But of course, those capital markets, they tend to be working in developed countries and less so in developing countries. So, it's amorphing the pump, if I can say. It's bringing more investment, bringing more liquidity to this investment, bringing more a more active active secondary market. So, for instance, right, one idea would be for development banks, MDBs, DFIs to be able also to buy shares of funds on the secondary markets much more than investing in primary markets. It's also making sure that this community of development banks, they bring liquidity to private investors. So building the foundations and the pipes for private investors to actually step in rather than almost competing with them by taking shares of those funds directly. I think that's what's needed. And then it's also we need the infrastructure as well, right? At another level, we need more education infrastructure. Very simply, more roads as well, for transportation to be more fluid and goods to be transferred from one country to another more easily. So those are simple ideas, but they need to be put in place and very concretely.
Thank you. How about the intersection here between, we need to strengthen the economy in Africa, but also we need to be able to address the other parts of the SDGs, that's the nature to preserve. We have a escalating climate crisis, and we have a loss of biodiversity that's devastating. So from your perspective, coming from this beautiful continent, how do you ensure the protection of nature so we don't just go all in and invest and don't really take into account that we need to protect that side of the coin?
It's interesting because I was in an interesting discussion with the president of Botswana yesterday. Of that very beautiful and gorgeous country, just talking about traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, right? And generations of it in terms of understanding the connection between people and planet and nature. And I think it is there, right? And as we think about, particularly as Africans, as we think about the future of our individual nations, I'm proudly Nigerian, how do we make sure that knowledge is not lost, nor is our identity lost, because most African cultures are very closely aligned with nature. And even as we open up for business for the world, and we've always been open, we need to make sure that we just don't lose that. And I think that requires an intentionality and of bringing people into the conversation because our cultures indigenously are connected to planet.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's take a final question here before I ask you to give a call to action, because I sometimes like to do that. So looking ahead, what key actions of shifts are needed from African leaders? We touched upon this a bit before, and also from the global community to fully unlock the transformative possibilities of working with the SDGs to enhance the speeding up the delivery of the SDGs in Africa. Do you have any thoughts on this, Matteo?
So I would say that, if we look at the investors' environment right now, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Africa is not doing well, right? In the last 10 years, all the flow capital that was supposed to come to Africa to sort of generate a similar economic and social boom to what happened, for instance, in East Asia, didn't really happen, didn't really concretize. And that's because of many issues that we talk about during this panel, but there are a series of numbers that are really sort of useful to understand the situation. For instance, the Africa Development Bank said that in order to empower Africa under an economic and social perspective and really leave that sort of change that is needed under SDG perspective, the amount of capital needed is 400 billion per year.
Per year?
Yes,
That's
and this is
numbers.
actually the current annual funding gap that the Africa is experiencing, which is around 40% of its GDP. And the economic sort of ecosystem right now between Africa and the rest of the world is currently, in terms of gaps, growing. DFIs are not investing as much as they should into the continent. Only around, I think, 3 or 4% of the total amount of capital of DFIs and NDVs are in Africa. So these are the current situation. But what can really be done, and what is I'm honestly very not only passionate but also optimistic about, is that you have these key actors that are slowly but steadily implementing new solutions on the ground. If you look at the trend, for instance, of the philanthropic money going to Africa, this is increasing year by year, and we know how important philanthropic capital is when it comes to de-risking investments and similar activities. And in addition to that, you have the governments in Africa that are slowly but steadily improving what we like to call the public capital deployment efficiency. So they're using their money slightly better, and they are getting closer and closer in terms of involving private actors, where usually they were not supposed to, or were usually not investing. So they're using their capital to achieve a 10x, 5x type of impact through innovative financial instruments. So in the short term, the situation is not so great, let's put it this way, but the perspective on the medium-long term are much better.
Thank you, Matteo. So, time for the call to action here. We have a lot of global leaders gathered here in Davos, and we have millions of people watching our broadcasts. So, some of them might actually be listening to your call to action, some of the global leaders. So, what call to action would you like to send them in terms of how to enhance the financing of sustainable growth in Africa? Jacqueline, please start. Jump in.
I want to end.
Oh, you want to end? Yeah, that's clever. Guillaume, you were quick anyway.
So I would say, and I would tell them, try it. Invest in Africa, invest in emerging markets, invest in impact investing, and you will see that it actually works and brings a lot of impact, of course, but also very positive returns. I think the financial system is all built on trust, and so as long as we don't trust those countries and continents, it will not work, right? So we have to give trust to development. And when you look at specifically Africa, it's a continent that is growing very fast in terms of demography. Everything is needed. And you don't need to be an economist to know that growth is the result of the growth of demography and also the productivity gains that can be done. So even from a pure rational perspective, that's where productivity will happen because a lot has to catch up, right, with other countries. And that's also where demography is rising very, very rapidly.
Excellent.
We have no choice, right? It's a continent where 1 out of 4 people will leave tomorrow. We need to build infrastructures, we need investment for that, and that's going to be rewarding, so invest.
So invest. Thank you, Guillaume. Matteo, a little bit shorter if you can, because I'm looking at the clock.
I'll do my best. My advice is do not try to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of solutions that are actually currently working under a financial investment perspective, but at the same time try to be bold in terms of innovation and exploring projects and activities that are not usually considered so much bankable or traditional investments.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Jacqueline, you get the last word.
Yeah, and I would say, similar to what my colleagues have said, it is be bold. There's a lot of opportunity there. There is a lot of potential for innovation. And there is a population that is hungry for it. And so go in and just make some magic happen, but stay connected to community and understand local needs and concerns.
Well, thank you very much, Jacqueline. Thank you very much, Guillaume. And thank you very much, Matteo, for joining us here in front of the Arctic Base Camp here for the We Don't Have Time broadcast. And you have inspired us. You have inspired the viewers. And I'm turning now to the audience here watching this. If you want to interact with these fabulous speakers, you can go online on our platform. We have all sorts of opportunities for you to share your stories to help push this development. Because what you're talking about here is real, and it's very promising, and there's ways to build Africa stronger and stay green. I mean, we don't need to fight against economy and nature with the growing economy. We can fix this. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now let's move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.